Hello and welcome to Nocab Game Design. In the previous 3 episodes of this series, I have spent the entire time so far talking about tutorial design. Honestly, my favorite topic. If you haven't seen those episodes, I strongly recommend you go back and check them out. But to summarize those videos, in the first 2, I defined the traditional tutorial design formula and gave a couple of examples, specifically the circle, then hallway, then open room. And this happened twice, once for teaching the player how to move, and once for teaching the player how to do combat. In the previous episode, the 3rd of the series so far, I talked about the alternative style of tutorial that the developers use in this game, telling the player to figure it out on their own. In this case specifically, there was a lot of support, and I talked about that, and it introduces the puzzle genre to the game. But the gameplay continues. We are now slowly exiting the early game, and slowly moving into the standard gameplay loop for the player. In this episode, Link takes on the Far-On Woods dungeon, the first dungeon of the game, and that means we're finally out of the tutorials, right? Wrong. The Legend of Zelda series is a masterpiece series because it's constant tutorials, but they're fun tutorials. The developers of Legend of Zelda somehow cracked the code and they made learning fun, constantly introducing new mechanics, new toys, new enemies, new puzzles and challenges to the player, but always slowly bringing them up to speed, balancing the player's skill versus challenge, while constantly giving the player new challenges for them to figure it out. In this episode, I'm analyzing the dungeon design, or trying to answer the question, how do the developers design fun tutorial environments? And because YouTube loves lists of 3s, the 3 main topics of discussion are going to be the exploration affordance, trusting the player, and the skill progression formula. So with that slightly longer intro than usual, let's play. Oftentimes, games imply a sense of discovery. They're not just a story being told to the user, but the player themselves are going on an adventure. This is one of the key differences between traditional storytelling mediums like books, movies, TV shows, and games. In the traditional storytelling mediums, the author has complete control over the events and characters in the story. But in games, the player also has some authorship responsibilities. They have direct control over the actions and events that are taking place on screen. Now, some games give more authorship control to the players and some games less, but that is a discussion for a different episode. But getting back to the exploration affordance specifically, what is the player exploring? Well, at the top level, it's pretty clear. The player is exploring the dungeon. But it's not just that. Each room in the dungeon has its own secrets to explore and discover. Every nook, cranny, and hallway can be thought of as an opportunity for a developer to add the exploration affordance. The key lesson here is richness. Add details. Put something in each and every room of the game for the player to interact with or explore. And give them a little reward for exploring. For the players that decide they want to swim all the way out to the far corner of this water room and find this secret area, they are rewarded for it. Good design. Another classic and very important game design tool here is giving the players a way to track their progress. Notice the map of this dungeon slowly fills out as you explore. This is great design because one of the inverses of exploration is being lost. You don't want your players to be lost, so giving them a map is incredibly helpful towards that end. And also, if you want to encourage the players to explore, then you need to define a boundary of what is already known and show the players right here, to the left of this room or through that door, is area that you have never seen before. Giving the player a map and letting them slowly fill it out solves these 2 problems. It helps make sure the player never gets lost, and it points the player in the directions that they should be exploring in. Great, excellent game design. I usually recommend putting maps in your games. It's just excellent. The last type of exploration that I want to point out in this episode is not necessarily a physical exploration, but an exploration of the play space. This dungeon is filled with puzzles, and in order to find the solution, the player needs to explore a little bit. Early in the dungeon, the solution is in the same room as the puzzle. Take, for example, this room. How does the player get across the gap? Well, they need to raise the bridge, but how to do that is not immediately clear. Yes, Midna does give pretty explicit hints pretty early, and that's good because this is the first puzzle in the area. But the solution is in the room itself. The player just needs to light these torches on fire. So, in other words, assuming that we never got the hint, in order to make progress, the player needs to explore the room that they're in. But just walking around is not enough. They also need to interact with something. They need to explore the affordances available to them. They have the sword, the slingshot, the lantern, maybe a few other items. What in this room can I use the affordances available to me? Let me explore the play space a little bit. This thing I can set on fire. I'll just set all these things on fire because what else am I to do? I want to explore the gameplay a little bit, and that is how you make progress. So early in the dungeon, the solution is in the room itself. Later in the dungeon, the solution is in the next door room. You have to go to a different area, do something there, and then return to the original room to solve the puzzle. This is a little more complicated, so it happens later in the dungeon. And again, this is a type of exploration that's being rewarded. In order to make progress, you have to explore around, and not just forward, but also backwards sometimes. This is excellent reuse of assets and a good way to encourage the players to constantly be exploring, even when walking through areas that they've already been. And finally, to cap it all off, the boss rooms. There are a couple different bosses in this dungeon, and in order to defeat them requires full exploration of the dungeon. Yes, opening the boss room door requires exploring most all of the dungeon, but also in order to defeat the boss in the boss encounter requires knowing the solutions to most all of the puzzles in the rooms leading up to it. I'll talk more about the boss fights in the skill progression formula section of this video near the end. Exploration is an extremely fun and motivating affordance. It's a big reason why people play video games, to escape the mundane reality and go explore a new virtual world. But the exploration affordance is only fun if it's the player who's driving the exploration. The player needs to want to explore. Otherwise, it's just fetch quests. Now, there's a fine line between too much hand-holding and sink or swim. Throwing a player into a new world and telling them exactly where to go and what to do, or giving them nothing. That line is kinda hard to define, and it really depends on the mood of the game that you're going for, your target audience, and a whole bunch of other game design factors. So I can't really define a formula for you here. All I can do is observe Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess and try and estimate where the developers of this game put the line, and come up with a couple reasons of why. And generally speaking, the developers are pretty hands-off here. The player really is thrown into the dungeon and they kind of get to go wherever they want to go, do whatever they want to do. There's no arrow pointing the way, there's not that much support. At least, not that much explicit support. Midna is literally the player's shadow, following them wherever they go, and she often can provide helpful hints. This is a good first lesson to draw from this. Midna is acting as a release valve. If the player ever gets stuck on a puzzle or isn't quite sure where to go and what to do next, the player can ask Midna what's going on. And based on whatever room she's in, she gives various hints and suggestions. She's not in your face and constantly asking for attention like some other helpful sidekicks in the Legend of Zelda series, but she is present. So exploration is driven by the player, but if they need a little bit of help, a second opinion on where to go, then it's always right there available to them. But even with her support, I still managed to get completely stuck in one room. And this is where I'll swerve into some modern game design. We live in the internet age now. We as game designers have to accept that. There will always be online tutorials, video walkthroughs, and fan-created Wikipedia pages for every video game that you make, especially if it's a masterpiece game like one of the Legend of Zelda games. And you should be striving to make good games that inspire people to go out and make content about it. So, like it or not, there's always going to be an online tutorial for your game. Now, in general, I think it's better game design to have a character like Midna, an in-game resource and hint giver for the player to prompt them on where to go and what to do, than the alternative, which is going online to find tutorials and exiting the game to interact with other systems to figure out where to go. But the internet is still there. You can't make it go away just for your pure game design vision, so keep it in mind when you're developing. Okay, so the Twilight Princess developers are not actively pushing the player in any direction. They have support for if the player gets stuck in the form of Midna and online tutorials now, but how do they motivate exploration? What about this dungeon actually compels a player to explore? What makes the exploration fun here? Well, I believe that it's because the exploration of this area begets discovery. If the player isn't discovering stuff on their own, then they're not really exploring. They're just following. And I talked a lot about this in my second ever video I made on this channel, back in the Halo series, talking about exploration versus following. And I made a big stink that following is really boring, whereas exploration is really fun. Every room in this dungeon that the player explores, there's something for them to discover inside of it. They're not just empty rooms. Yes, sometimes the discovery is just extra rupees, but more often it's a new mechanic. Somersaulting into this totem pole causes stuff to fall over. These bug things explode, and you can use that to unlock paths deeper into the area. And sometimes the reward for exploration is new characters, dialogue, or meta-game stuff, like Ukuwu, or however her name is pronounced, OOCCOO. She can warp you out of dungeons after you've discovered her, but you can only discover her by finding this secret area. The developers are motivating exploration here by giving the players things to discover in these new areas. It's worth exploring, and so the player wants to explore more. And this all ties back to the original question that I asked in the intro of this video. How are the developers making tutorials fun? Because this area does feature a lot of tutorials for these new mechanics. They're doing it by letting the players discover these mechanics and features and interactions on their own. It's not explicit text tutorials, it's exploration and discovery-based tutorials. So I've made the claim in this video that this Far On Woods dungeon is a tutorial, teaching the player new mechanics and affordances. For example, the bomb, the boomerang, or even minor things like somersaulting into totem poles to get them to knock their stuff over. But there's more than just a simple tutorial happening here. This is a dungeon, which implies that there needs to be some level of challenge for the player. So how do the developers take a complete novice at a new skill, like the bombs or boomerangs, and bring them up to mastery level of that skill? How do the developers progress the player's skill? What is the skill progression formula presented in the Far On Woods dungeon? This, I think, is best illustrated by an example. Let's talk about the bomb bug. First, this new affordance is introduced to us kind of as a side event in a room. It's kind of off on this side hallway near the corner of the room, right next to a destroyable wall also. So it's not just placed there randomly, there's a reason to have it here. But the main activity of this room is a late game fan puzzle and to provide access to other areas of the dungeon too, along with some combat and platforming. The bomb is really not the focus of the room, but it is still introduced to the player early. It is up to the player to explore this new affordance if they wish. It's not required for progress. That's step one of the progression formula. Introduce it as a side effect and let the player play with it if they wish. Step two is using the new affordance as a key to solving the puzzle in a room, the main event of a room. For example, in this room that's slightly deeper in the dungeon, the player must use the bombs in order to destroy these carnivorous plants. That way they can progress through the room and get to the rooms beyond, which is the main gameplay loop. But this room is still calm. There's not really any enemies pressuring the player, there's not really any time limits or any danger to the player here. They're just forced to use the affordance in a calm setting to show that they understand what it's useful for. And the final element of the skill progression formula demonstrated here is that the developers are forcing the player to demonstrate mastery of the skill in a high-pressure environment. And in this dungeon specifically, that means it's a boss fight. In this room, there's a giant carnivorous plant that look very similar to the plants that we learned about in Step 2. So the player is already primed. They've been taught to use the bombs to defeat enemies that look like this. But this is no longer a calm situation. It's a boss fight. The player only has limited health resource and they're constantly being attacked. They have to prove that they understand the mechanic and are able to use it in high pressure situations. After they have completed the boss fight, then they get a monkey, which allows them to traverse deeper into the dungeon and on. But now the developers know the player has mastered this affordance, and they can start using it in more and more complicated and challenging and high-pressure situations later in the game. This is the skill progression formula demonstrated here, and really it's just an expression of flow theory. I've talked about it a little bit in previous episodes, but to summarize, flow theory says that the challenge presented to the player must match the player's skill. The player is introduced to a new affordance. They have no skill, and so there must be no challenge in order to use it. But they get more and more familiar with it. Their skill rises. Now they have to use it and demonstrate understanding in a calm situation. And finally, the challenge is maximized. In order to get through the challenge, the player has to maximize their skill to keep up. This is fun, according to flow theory. And the developers don't use this formula once, they use it for almost all of the affordances given to the player in this area. For example, the boomerang. As soon as they get it, they're forced to use it in order to walk across these wind bridges to get back to the rest of the dungeon. This is a safe, simple, and clear area for the player to practice their skill. Later, a puzzle is presented to the player, moving these bombs around in order to destroy the destroyable walls. The player needs to figure out that they have to use the boomerang in order to move the bombs around fast enough and accurately enough. This is a higher challenge area than the bridges, and the player's skill, hopefully, has risen to meet the challenge. And finally, of course, there's the dungeon boss that requires the same skill of the puzzle, moving bombs around, but in a high-pressure situation in order to destroy the boss. And it goes even further. There's a second phase to the boss fight. Require delivering moving bombs against the target. No longer are the bombs just planted on the ground. This is an even higher challenge presented to the player, and therefore they must express a higher skill level. And because the skill is matching the challenge, ideally, this boss encounter is fun. Growing your skill level is fun. This tutorial is fun. To summarize this entire episode today, I'll return to that first question I asked in the intro. How do the developers design fun tutorial environments? In order to answer this question, I started talking about the exploration affordance, a very powerful motivator of play. This is the initial hook that gets the player to actually want to engage with the environment. But then, the developers took it one step further. It's not just exploring a new environment, it's also discovering new things, both gems and treasure, and in-game affordances. It's this discovery of new game affordances and mechanics that the developers are using as a tutorial. So as the players explore the dungeon and slowly learn new mechanics and affordances and get new tools and items, the players use these skills to continue exploring. And in the meantime, the developers have designed the dungeon with the skill progression formula in mind. First, introducing the new things to the player as a side effect, then making the affordance or tool or whatever a required piece of tech that the player needs to use in a calm setting in order to make progress, and then finally setting up a boss encounter that the only way to defeat the boss is by demonstrating mastery of the new ability. This skill progression formula is what's pulling the player from complete novice up to skilled user of whatever it is the developers are trying to teach the player about. This is excellent game design, and one of the reasons why I love the Legend of Zelda series. Every dungeon that is presented, not just in this game, but throughout the series, teaches the player about a new mechanic or affordance. And this learning, this teaching, is still fun. This is the gameplay. It's just amazing design. So with all of that in mind, I will hand things back to you, the viewer, and ask you a question. Do you consider the Far On Woods dungeon to be a tutorial? If so, why? If not, why not? And if you liked this video or any of the questions that I asked, then consider subscribing. It really helps a channel like mine, and it teaches the algorithm that you are interested in game design content. So you'll see more of it. Not just my channel, but other related similar channels to mine. In the next episode, our search for the missing children continues, and the game slowly becomes a little bit more of an open world exploration. I'll see you there.